Carolina, but thank you for having me today. Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for those very powerful and moving words. And I don't know why they asked me to go after you, but I will be faithful to that call. I'm grateful for all the testimonies and sharing.
Reynolds, we can't hear you very well. If you can check your mic, maybe.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Can you hear me
That's
better
much
now?
better.
My
Yes,
hands were covering up my microphone, I think.
perfect.
They tell you what to do with your hands when you're preaching, but not when you're preaching on a computer. I'll try to keep them away from there. Well, I'll be sharing today about how God has used Durham, the place that I live, to teach me to lament. Throughout my journey, I've come to believe that without a place to ground our lament, the practice and discipline of lament will be thin and fickle. At Durham Cares, the nonprofit that I direct, we've been leading people through this journey we call the Durham Pilgrimage of Pain and Hope that Valerie referred to. It's a journey of discovering how Durham's story, our own stories, and God's story are woven together. Part of that journey is visiting the Stagville Plantation, North Carolina's largest plantation, which was 47 square miles at its height, 30,000 acres, and enslaved thousands of people. And let's be clear, what I mean by plantation is forced labor camp. But as a city that began after the Civil War, the legacy of slavery does not figure prominently in our collective memory. In fact, we think quite highly of ourselves for our progressive identity in Durham. But if you venture out from downtown Durham with all its condos and boutiques and breweries and go all the way to the edge of the county, to Stagville's small, humble, historic site, you will encounter a dramatic shift from the facade of progress toward the hidden reality that we are a city built and continuing to build on the labor of enslaved people. Stagville Plantation is one of the sites on the Durham Pilgrimage of Pain and Hope where we encounter the ground, we encounter structures around us, we encounter objects that we can hold in our hands, and we encounter the stories of people. And God uses all of these encounters to discipline us in the practice of lament. So today, I'd like to take you there, to go on a sort of mini pilgrimage to Durham, to testify to you of the place that has grounded my lament. I want to briefly share the stories of 3 people from Stagville who have taught me 3 different aspects of lament that I believe are crucial in our discipleship today. Those people are Mary Walker, Peter Leslie, and Duncan Cameron. And they have shown me lament as an outcry, lament as solidarity, and lament as confession. I'm going to begin with Mary Walker, who has shown me lament as an outcry. She was an enslaved woman at Stagville who was threatened by her enslaver to be sent to another plantation. And as a mother of 3, with other extended family on the plantation, she knew it would be better to escape and work for her family's emancipation than to be forcibly separated from her family and remain enslaved. So one summer, when she accompanied the enslaving family, the Cameron family, on a visit to Philadelphia in 1848, she fled. She then worked tirelessly for the next 17 years trying to free her children from the plantation in North Carolina. We don't have many writings from Mary Walker, but we see her lament as an outcry in the writings of the Leslie family who took her in after she escaped from slavery. In a letter Peter Leslie wrote to the Cameron family to ask him to set Mary Walker's family free, he writes, "I have seen how sick at heart she is about her mother and especially her 2 children. With all this, her heart is slowly breaking. She thinks of nothing but her children and speaks of nothing else when she speaks of herself at all, which is very seldom. Her mother heart yearns unspeakably after them, and her eyes fail with looking towards the south. Let's just take that in for a moment. Now, we have been conditioned to be self-conscious about our own reactions to violence and suffering, our own lament. We think, what should I say? What should I post on Facebook in response? How do I speak on this in my sermon? How do I lament this? And we'll get to that, but before we think about our own lament, let us focus on Mary Walker's lament. She is the one who bore the violence of slavery, and she is the one longing for her children. This is the lament we hear in Jeremiah 31:15. A voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children and refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. On one of the pilgrimages we took to Stagville, I remember a white participant being very intrigued by the historical details. What kind of crops were grown, what kind of tools were used, dates and laws that were significant. And during the discussion after the guided tour, a Black participant shared how deeply painful it was for her to be there, how she just wanted to leave, and how the preoccupation with historical details felt callous. Those who are directly impacted are the ones who fully understand lament as outcry. One of the abolitionists that Mary Walker had appealed to for help, Ellis Loring, told her that she should just, quote, give up her mother and children as if they were dead. He was actually trying to console her. Of course, Miss Walker was indignant. She asked, if it were their daughter who was in slavery, would they give her up and form other ties? Lament as outcry is something that God uniquely gives to people who experience oppression. The rest of us would do well to remove the sandals from our feet when we encounter it, to resist offering our input or even our own monopolizing performances of lament. But it does raise the question, what does lament look like if you're not oppressed? In other words, what does lament as solidarity look like? Dr. Wilson shared some great things about what that looks like. I'm going to build on what she shared. Peter Leslie is the person who has shown me lament as solidarity. He was an abolitionist minister who took in Mary Walker after she escaped. He certainly had many things to say, many cries of lament. After all, he was a preacher. We know how preachers are, right? But the heart of his lament as solidarity was in his listening and his embrace of Mary Walker. He shows hospitality and legal risk by taking her into his home. He advocates against the unjust laws and the system of slavery. And he writes to the enslaver of Mary Walker's family to ask them to set her children and mother free. Now, his risk and sacrifice will never compare to the risk and sacrifice of Mary Walker. But it is certainly true that lament drew him into action. Now, I need to add a caveat here. Action can be driven by avoidance sometimes, or by an effort to console ourselves or an effort to congratulate ourselves. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a place of empathy and communion that is so deep that the one who is not oppressed cries out with the one who is. It's an empathy that is so deep that it's impossible for the lament not to carry over into action. But the third form of lament is the one that I actually want us to pay special, extra attention to. Lament as confession. And not because it's most important, but because it's the most overlooked. In my experience, this slow reemergence of lament into the life of the Western church has focused on lament as outcry and lament as solidarity. But as I encountered the stories of Mary Walker and Peter Leslie, another question has weighed heavy on me. How do I encounter the story of Duncan Cameron, the one who enslaved Mary Walker? My default is to distance myself and lament the evil in him. How could there be someone that evil who could do such atrocious things? But the more that I've continued to go on pilgrimage at the Stagville Plantation, the more I've seen the ways that I am complicit in the world that Duncan Cameron created. The Cameron name is found on street signs and buildings, monuments, and churches throughout what is known as the Triangle, Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. The railroad on which Durham Station was built, which would become the starting point for the city of Durham when it was founded in 1869, was built by the enslaved people owned by Duncan Cameron to import and export goods to the plantation. The banking infrastructure that funded the building of Durham came from the wealth of the Stagville Plantation. Duncan Cameron continues to be admired and respected for his financial, industrial, and legal contributions to Durham today. If my lament over Durham's legacy of slavery is only solidarity, it would be easy for me to overlook all the things that I have inherited from the Cameron family. But if my lament is also confession, I begin to see the ways that I benefit from the laws that Duncan Cameron helped establish, the narratives about white superiority he upheld, and the wealth that built Durham that I can more easily access as a white person. We do not need to be written into a will to receive an inheritance from oppressors who came before us. So many of the laments in Scripture are confessions. The psalmist in Psalm 130 cries, "Out of the depths I cry to you. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, Lord, who could stand?" When Nehemiah sees the destruction of Jerusalem, he weeps, mourns, fasts, prays, and calls out in confession, saying, "Both I and my family have sinned." Lament as confession is foundational to our Christian identity. It is recognizing that we take part in the brokenness of this world, and we need Christ's healing. The white supremacy we have inherited from Duncan Cameron has reinvented itself generation after generation, up until now, where instead of being hunted by slave patrols, Black and brown people are hunted by police. Those who have been directly impacted cry out in lament, as some of those who are not oppressed join them. And this lament has an action, a movement. It flows out into the streets as we protest unjust policing and seek to abolish our violent and racist system of public safety. But those of us who are not directly impacted can't deny that we benefit from the very thing that we lament. We must ask ourselves this: do we see ourselves in Derek Chauvin? That question is not meant to sympathize with evil. It's meant to interrogate the sin in ourselves. Mr. Silkett asked yesterday, what bitterness do I need to release? Well, for those of us who participate in oppression, what oppression do we need to release in this work of reconciliation? We always have a propensity to oppress, and only the practice of confession will allow us to move from oppressor to solidarity. Yesterday, Dr. Cologne Emmerich shared that Christ is the beginning, the end, and the center way. And I believe that seeing Jesus Christ as such illuminates that full picture of lament. Jesus offered up all three laments that I've shared. He offered up lament as outcry, lament as solidarity, and lament as confession. His lament of solidarity led him to give up everything and become the one who was oppressed. When he cried out, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" He cried out in lament as the one who took on all our oppression, not just in that moment, but throughout his whole life. He cried out as the directly impacted one. And although he was without sin, he offered up a confession on our behalf, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." Christ is indeed the beginning, the end, and the center way of our lament. The Word became flesh, and the Word becomes flesh in each of our own communities. So let us go there with Christ. May our lament be grounded in the places that we are, and may it be shaped by the life of Christ. Amen.